Welcome. I'm Lisa Allen, and this is As a Matter of Fact. On today's episode, we are tackling the topic trust and political polarization in America. Earlier this year, Pew Research Center released a report that trust is on the decline in America. The report highlights that fading trust from a political perspective can be a sign of cultural sickness, national decline, and even be linked to the increase of loneliness spreading across the country, perpetuating cynicism of one another and spawning suspicion across party lines. How do we reverse this course and start to rebuild trust again? How do we break down barriers that create a willingness to talk to those who may not think like ourselves? Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Charles Hecksher, who will help us analyze these concepts and share his groundbreaking research in this field. Charles is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University in labor studies and employment relations. As a researcher and educator, he focuses on organizational change and identifying possibilities of more collaborative forms of work. He has authored numerous research papers and books, and his work has been published in leading journals such as the Academy of Management Review, the British Journal of Industrial Relations, and Harvard Business Review. In 2016, his book titled Trust in a Complex World, Enriching Community was the winner of the Honorable George R. Terry Award. Thank you so much for joining me today, Charles. That was a long introduction.
Yeah.
This is a topic close to my heart. When I went through my master's at Montclair State, I did research around trust, political polarization, social media, and over the last couple of years, since really 2016, it's become a popular research field. So thank you for coming on to talk about it today. The first question on my mind is distrust as bad as we think, and how did we get here?
Yes, it is, I think, and I'm really worried because I think the cycle of mistrust is accelerating, and that's a very bad thing for societies. So it's been declining there's a lot of research on this, really since the 1970s. Polarization has been increasing, trust is on many dimensions, confidence in institutions, for example, confidence in the government, even in business, in unions, and so on, have all been declining. People feel adrift, like they don't know how things can be fixed anymore, and so on. So gradually it's only more recently that has started to crystallize into two sides, where each side thinks they've got the answer. There was kind of a period of growing distrust, but now we're at a stage where each side thinks if you would just do it the way I say, we could fix it. And that becomes, so then when things don't go right, then you blame the other side and so on, and it just spirals downward. And that has happened many times before in history, and it ends badly. It happened in our Civil War. It happened, it's a precursor to wars in general, because it's very hard to get out of. Once you can always blame the other side. You can always, when things are going to go wrong, you can always do that, and then then the other side blames you, and it just gets worse and worse. Right. So that's where we are, and it's a very dangerous situation.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, when you get to your point, when you're really entrenched, it's hard to move the needle on empathy or conversation, collaboration. George Washington, James Madison, they all have written about the dangers of political partisanship and being really attached to your party over the common good. And so I feel like we're starting to ignore the wisdom of our forefathers who built this country in terms of understanding that while political party is important, it is not more important than the common good for everyone.
Well, the problem is how to get to the common good. I mean, I think in a sense everybody would say they're for the common good and they're trying to reach it. They just have different ideas about how to get there. So it's not, but you're right, the problem of faction was one of the primary concerns in the Federalist Papers and around the debates around the Constitution. And we're certainly into that now. And as I say, we've been at it in a few other times in our history. I think the only way to begin to get out of it is to have more dialogue across the parties, have people actually talk to each other. What happens is people tend to pull apart in these times, talk only to each other, see the other side only as a kind of caricature and a stereotype. And that needs to be broken down. That's what we're working on.
Yeah, so let's dive into that because everybody wants to point to why this is happening. When you look at, so again, back to Pew, they had said that looking at the chart, since the mid-90s, political polarization has been on the rise. So it didn't happen in 2016, even though it feels as though that was probably the breaking point. It's, to your point, you said it's been happening probably since the 70s. It's just becoming much more prevalent. Why does it seem in such an educated society and a society that we have worked very hard on anti-bullying, listening to one another, collaborating more, why is there a dissonance between that ideology of being more unified versus what's playing out right now? Do we point to social media? Or do we point to generational gaps? What have you found in your research?
Well, one important point is that, as you say, it's a long thing. This has been going for many decades now. It's also very wide. The United States is not the only place this is happening. It's happening throughout the advanced industrial world and even beyond that. So Europe is, riven with these populist, you've seen Brexit, you've seen all these things. So this is a very wide thing. It's not something that's happening in the U.S., can't be explained by particular U.S. events, by particular politicians, by particular events. It's broader than that. And I think the driving force is, in a word, complexity. That we are faced with more complex problems and more complex relations and more complex interdependencies than ever before in history. So, even in the 1950s, when you got your milk at the grocery store, it was probably coming from a farm down the road. You kind of knew the farmer. It was sort of right. Now, probably from, I don't know, Argentina or something, and you don't know where it's coming from and what all the processes it's gone through, and so so that's just a microcosm of what happens every day, all the time in our lives. We're dependent on people. We have no idea who they are. And when we do know who they are, we often don't like them because they're very different from us, right? So I think that's the driving force that's been sort of affecting everybody, whether it's in the U.S., in Europe, even in the middle, or in lesser developed nations as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I actually co-host another show, Community Conversation, and we interviewed a gentleman, Tom Franklin, who just did a whole series on the refugee crisis. Mm-hmm. And so you're right. We talked about that this isn't just an American issue. Around the globe, people are having difficulty communicating with each other, and interpersonal relationships are breaking down. And when interpersonal relationships break down, that means problems cannot be solved. Right. And so I think that with the explosion of the refugee crisis, the ability to reach out across social media and see more than we used to, it is all of a sudden shift, and we are dealing with a whole new identity of ourselves, as humanity, I think, across the globe. Right. And so it could create fear about, there are people that are losing their homes and they're coming into new regions. Yeah. And so Tom was talking about how you have two types of individuals who, there are a lot of people being welcomed in, but there's a lot of people who are also fearful because economically it's hard to sustain large influx of individuals coming into a society, and managing that financially. Right.
No, I think any refugee, I'm generally in favor of immigration, and reaching out, but it has to be managed, and you have to work at it, and you can't just open the gates. It's like in your home, you could take in a foreign student, perhaps if you got a big enough home, and get to know them, and they'd be very different at first, and you'd have dinner, and you get to know them, and it's sort of integrate them gradually into your family. If you had 20 of them, it would be a very different thing.
Right, that's a different dynamic.
Exactly, a different dynamic. Yeah. And that's essentially the problem. And so when trust declines and things begin to go wrong, the natural tendency is to retreat and try to be less connected to and less dependent on others. So if the bus system starts breaking down, you can't trust the bus to be there anymore, you get in your car and and do it yourself. If you don't trust the police, you try to get a gun. If so on and so forth. So that's the dynamic that's happening everywhere. People want to shut out those who are threatening and different because they want to pull back to something they can control.
Right. So let's talk about your book because it talks about trust and building a new type of community. Tell us about that.
Well, I think the problem that we face in a sort of big picture is that we only know one kind of trust, which is, I call traditionalistic. It's a kind of trust which is based on shared tradition, shared that we've all kind of been through the same thing, and we know that. And that is a very powerful and very effective, very important form of trust. Same religion, same nation, same whatever it is. But it is also, it puts barriers and boundaries up against those who are outside that tradition, right? Mm-hmm. And so historically, it's been the basis, again, for warfare and all kinds of conflicts, because people with different traditions don't understand each other, don't trust each other. There's really no way to trust each other. They only trust those within their tradition. We're in a world now which is so interdependent and so complex that we got to open those boundaries quite a lot, but we don't know very well how to do that. I mean, that we have no resources for doing that. We don't, no mechanism. We're trying to invent them. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about things like anti-bullying and so on, those are very new things that we're starting to think about. How do we actually get people to think about the way they treat others and so on? How do we change? How do we build our own traditions? How do we build our new ways of doing things? Mm-hmm. That's very new. And that's the kind of community that I was trying to start to sketch out there, which is, I guess you would call it a deliberate community or a collaborative community.
Right. Deliberative dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
deliberative. Yeah. Okay. Explain what that means, deliberative.
Well, it means that so in a traditionalistic community, the rules are kind of handed down. Right? There's not much question. Sometimes they can happen, as in the case of our Constitution, through a great crisis. Through everybody gets together and forms a new set of rules because there's such a huge shared crisis. But most of the time, it's just that they're handed down through traditions, through religions, through socialization, and so on. You don't question them very much. But when you're in a situation like now, people don't know what the rules are. Women, the Me Too movement has changed the rules, but no one quite knows what they are, right?
Right, right.
Is it all right to hug somebody? Is it not all right to hug somebody, and so on? So you have to talk about it. You have to make the rules by talking. I mean, that's what a deliberative community would be, so that we come to an agreement, which is not a contract, right? Because it's not, you're not going to sign on a dotted line, but an understanding of what's right, what's wrong, how should we treat each other, and so that takes a while to do, and you have to have mechanisms for doing it, which we have not had in the past.
As somebody who does research and educate and has been in education a long time, is there a paradigm, like a framework that that you can use for trust? Is there one size fits all? Is it a variety of paradigms? What are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like if we had a paradigm to work from, then the rules would be clearer. It would be easier to make the rules.
Right. No, I mean, I don't think there is a simple paradigm. The problem with trust is, what is it? Mm-hmm. It's an expectation of the future, how somebody else is going to act in the future, Mm-hmm. You trust, right? So why should you trust how somebody else is going to act in the future? That's really tricky, and there are lots of different reasons you might. You might trust it because there's a law, and they know if they don't behave the way you expect that they'll get thrown in jail. Right. But that's only for a very small number of things. They might trust it because, we're part of the same, they're part of a group, and that if they act bad, that people will ostracize them and criticize them, shame them, social pressure, exactly. They might have deep beliefs, they would feel guilty. There are a lot of different reasons, and you've got to actually have all of them together to have a stable society. It's when you have trust that's founded, doing the right thing is also good for you, and it also wins you approval, and you don't get thrown in jail. When those things work together, then you have a strong society, and it takes time to build all that up.
Right. So social media has changed the rules.
Yeah.
Can we blame social media?
It's a symptom as much as anything. I mean, I think it's, it's a good example of the problem. Yeah. Because social media is a place where we are broadening our interactions a lot. I mean, I tell this story, sort of a book about a Christmas a few years ago when my kids were sitting around the Christmas tree and all on their phones, right? So I said, well, wow, and
everybody's on their phones, they're ignoring us.
Yes, right, yes.
We're not having family time. And you're going to enjoy family time. Right?
Absolutely. And that was, and then they came in and they said, then we had a great conversation. in the room, and it turned out that, one had been talking to a friend in Europe, and talking about what they were doing, one in China, and they weren't having Christmas, but what were they doing instead of it? So all kinds of things were brought into that room. We had a great conversation that would never have been there before when you gather every Christmas and you see the same people and you go through the same routines. So it's potentially positive, it's potentially fragmenting. And I think in that case it was positive because we had a conversation about it. Yeah. If we hadn't, we might have have felt, oh, how terrible these kids aren't talking to us, and they might have been annoyed that we were trying to, trying to build a collective game or something that we might have tried. So talking about it in the right way is critical. It was there. That's what, if you, I don't know if that's a paradigm, but if there's a paradigm, it's around that. Did you have to actually talk about things? And you have to have experiences together. You have to structure things that people share, and that builds trust.
Well, that's actually a good lead into Better Angels.
Yeah.
Because you're working with them to build a better conversation. Why don't you talk about the work that you do? Because you volunteer.
Yeah.
And you have been working across the country in various aspects. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, Better Angels, the core of it is these conversation or discussions of reds and blues, equal numbers of reds and blues, where they try to understand each other. That is, or begin to get to know each other a little more. And that's been quite, there have been thousands of those discussions around the country. That's been quite effective. Now we're into the stage of what happens next after you begin to do that. So we're building alliances. People are starting to discuss issues, not just sort of broad stuff, but gun control or gun violence, however you want to put that. That's controversial. Or healthcare, immigration, Trump. We're having these conversations about issues, not to change anybody's mind, but to get to understand better what people are thinking and why. And then we're just starting this phase, and it's what I've been focusing on most, of saying, well, okay, can we do anything about any of this? Together. Is there a way of together? And what's happened in these first discussions is people find, and there's lots of research behind this too, but they experience that they're not as different as they think, that they care about a lot of the same things, and the political system has fractured into these two intensely opposed parties, but the people are, on issues, there's a lot of overlap. Even on issues like guns or immigration, there's a lot of very strong, wide consensus, 70% plus on things like DACA, or on things like gun registration, some particular solutions within that. So not everybody's going to agree, but very wide, you could build a broad consensus, and people find that, oh yeah, I can sort of see that. and so then they might get together, and we're starting to do that, either on some community projects, education, community action, or developing policy, going to their legislators, et cetera. What I've become increasingly aware of, I'm sort of in charge of, or coordinating partnerships for Better Angels, is that there are a lot of groups doing this kind of thing, or in this space. There are hundreds of them. And it's growing quite fast. There's really quite a movement developing, and we're just now at the stage where all these little ones that all kinds of people started after 2016, some before, are saying, well, looking around and saying, well, how can we pull this together and get more? This thing called the Bridge Alliance, but there are media things that try to present both sides, what the media are saying on both sides or all sides of an issue. There's a thing called allsides.com. There's groups that hold town halls, digital town halls between citizens and representatives. There are groups that have built, the National Institute for Civil Discourse that has built a network of state legislators that talk across lines, that talk to each other. There's a group called No Labels, which is doing this in Congress, of pulling together Republicans and Democrats in Congress. So just, a whole range of things of people who are really concerned about this polarization. So we're just now trying to say, well, how does that all work together? How does the sort of on-the-ground work, citizen-based work of Better Angels tie into these legislative networks and so on? How can we connect it better? How can we start to rebuild the democratic conversation?
I still get stuck on this point that why why are we so entrenched though? I mean, what does your research show? Is it, and I'm just going to say, because the 2016 election, there were so many friends that I saw their friendship dissolve. I saw family members, their relationships dissolve. What is it about today that is so different, and so, why people got so entrenched, and they have almost the incapacity to have a deliberative dialogue unless they're in a space that allows for it?
Right. And encourages it.
Yeah.
I think it's partly a matter of skills. So it really is. We're not used to doing it. We didn't learn to do it in school or most of us, and it's hard. One little exercise in the Better Angels workshop, which I really like, is you have separate groups of the reds and the blues, and you say, ask a question to the other side that you actually want to know the answer to, not a gotcha question, right? People have a very hard time doing that. They ask a question, but they really know what the answer, and they've got to get, that they
You're gonna get them on that.
get them on that question.
Facts.
They think, yes.
Right.
How could you believe that? That kind of question, right? Or,
Right.
And so to get them, it takes work to get them to say, what do I actually want to know about from them? Why do they, what is it that I really want to know what the answer is.
Yeah.
People aren't used to doing that. So that's just a little example of the kind of thing that happens over the dinner table. You're asking gotcha questions instead of thinking
Critically.
Yeah.
Right, and understanding, if you are passionate about gun control, like what are the reasons that make you concerned about it? Why do you want to? So on a scale of 0 to 10, if you are passionate about gun control and you're a 6, sometimes I tell people, instead of talking about why you're not a 10, let's talk about why you're not a 4.
Right.
Right? Start thinking, so that helps start thinking about the common threads, the things that join people on an issue.
Right.
Right? And
Yeah, I was going to say on issues. Well, again, there's this broad overlap. I had a very interesting email exchange with a climate denier. I'm very much concerned about the climate myself, so it was he kept sending me articles about scientists who disagree with that, and I would sort of point out the consensus that disagree, and he would ignore that and send another article. So this went on for a while, and so it looked like it was just going nowhere. At a certain point, I started talking about renewable energy. And he said, oh, well, renewables, everybody knows that's the future. That's where we're going. So I said...
You're like, why didn't we start there?
Yeah, exactly. What are we arguing about?
Right.
So, and that's the way a lot of conversations go, right? So if you structure it right, you get to those more efficiently, to those places where, well, let's see what we can do around renewables. Let's forget about, beliefs about government and the world and so on and so forth. Maybe we can take some steps and realize that actually we care about some of the same things. We're not, and at least get somewhere, move the ball a little bit.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one other dynamic that I've seen is that back in the day, you're around the water cooler. Pre-technology, and you have a conversation about a candidate, you have a disagreement, but it's not in writing, and so you go home and you forget about it. You might remember that you had a disagreement, but there's nothing in writing to follow it. Today, because there's a paper trail, an electronic trail, or breadcrumbs around people and who they vote for and what their values are, what happens is they attribute the person that they vote for as you're just like that person.
Right.
We're having a hard time as a society being able to extrapolate why someone votes for someone versus that they're not the mirror image of them. Do you have any perspective on that? I find that's a really interesting dynamic too.
Yeah. I think there was always some of that, but it probably is because, as you say, it's written down and I mean, another thing, of course, is that trolls have entered the conversation in a way which never happened around the water cooler on the whole, or very rarely.
Right.
So that you have people who are deliberately trying to destabilize the conversation, either because they're from Russia or because they just are nasty people. So that you don't know who to trust, you don't know who you're talking to. It really destabilizes that kind of conversation. We're looking to try to find, we're in the moment now of trying to find rules, trying to build rules that control that and construct good conversations on the internet. This is not something that I've seen either research on or that particular aspect. But when you've written something down, you're more committed to it, right? So, and then somebody can hold you to it.
Yeah.
So it probably does help to, or contribute to the polarization, to the fact that people are sort of nailed down to one thing or another. I saw that, you said that, why did you say that? You've got to defend it.
Right,
Yeah.
now you're forced to defend it.
Right,
Yeah.
and that happened less around the water cooler because people forgot it.
Yeah.
more. Probably true.
And, as we wind down our time, because we don't have a ton of time left, but what about the media? I mean, we didn't really talk
Yeah.
about the role that they play in all of this.
Well, the media have gotten polarized too, of course. The whole, one of the things that's happened, let me take a broader, in the last 50 years, is citizens have gotten disengaged from the political process. So there's a lot less involvement, and so there's this whole layer of experts that has taken over the political process in between the citizenry and the government. Essentially, they're lobbyists and think tanks and media, that kind of take and they try to combine. So and the interest at that point, since the citizens aren't very much engaged, is to fire them up in order to get more readers or more money or whatever it is. So whether it's the NRA or the Sierra Club, they want to push their issue. And they want to make it as dramatic as possible and fire you up against the opposition so that you will give them money. And that's how, so the media is part of that, and has got, you fire up your base. You find your base, you fire them up.
Right.
And there's on that one, so problem
That's
is
a
how
great
to,
point, yeah.
problem is how to turn that around and
Yeah.
get the citizens to be active, and this is part of what we're trying to do with Better Angels, starting to. And to have these experts supporting citizen deliberation rather than being sort of what happens, the way politics is made. So on the media, there are a whole bunch. Again, this is remarkable. There's all sides. There's pro-con. There's the flip side. There's 7 or 8 of these things that are really trying to systematically present the various points of view on an issue. So you see every day what different people are saying. Interesting to me that today, one of the big issues, the day as we speak, is about the firing of the Navy, whatever that position is, because of the Trump's intervention in the disciplinary action. And this is one where it turns out that you look at the right-wing media and the left-wing, there's a lot of agreement that was probably an inappropriate, not everybody, there's some people, but there's, that was probably an inappropriate intervention. The right feels it undermines military discipline. And the left has somewhat different reasons, but there's a lot of agreement. So that's interesting to know. And to see that, and that helps build, I think, a more aware and critical view of the media.
Yeah, and I appreciate the work you do at Better Angels, because you're helping elevate the conversation and making political dialogue, cool again.
Well, I hope so.
All right. Well, I hate to close this off. I had such a nice time talking to you, and I'm going to have you come back, and we'll dive even deeper into some of the...
It's a big issue.
Yes, it is. All right. Thank you so much,
Thank
Charles.
you. Enjoy it.
And thank you for watching today. A wise person once said, "Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair." I'm unsure how long it will take to rebuild, but our society certainly doesn't have forever. Trust is one of the most critical elements to a well-functioning society. As iron sharpens iron, so man or woman sharpen each other. We all mutually benefit by understanding each other, finding common ground, and building trust. Being able to recognize our own conformational biases and how they impact conversations also helps open the space for a more empathetic dialogue. I would like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Lisa Allen, filming from the HTTV studio in Summit, New Jersey. For more programming like this, please visit our website, Facebook page, and Instagram, as well as LinkedIn, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of As a Matter of Fact. Have a great day.